before the chains that bound him to vengeance, before the blades that carved his legend in blood. There was simply a boy, a Spartan boy whose name would one day shake the very foundations of Olympus itself. This is not the story of the Ghost of Sparta you think you know. This is the tale of Kratos before the ghost, before the rage consumed everything he once held sacred. This is the story of how a warrior's love became his greatest weakness, and how that weakness forged the most dangerous enemy the gods would ever face. Welcome to the untold origin of the man who would defy the gods themselves. In the shadow of Mount Taygetus, where eagles soared and legends were born, two brothers learned the sacred art of war. Kratos and Deimos, names that would echo through eternity, though only one would live to hear that echo. The Agogum was merciless. Spartan children were not coddled or protected. They were forged in fire and tempered in blood. From the age of 7, they knew no comfort save the brotherhood of their fellow warriors. But for Kratos, there was something more. Something that burned brighter than duty, stronger than discipline: love. The bond between Kratos and Deimos transcended typical sibling rivalry. Where other Spartan children were taught to suppress emotion, to view weakness as failure, Kratos couldn't help but protect his younger brother. Deimos bore a distinctive red birthmark across his body, a mark that would prove to be both prophecy and curse. You see, the oracle had spoken of a marked warrior who would bring about the destruction of Olympus. And in the paranoid minds of the gods, every marked child was a potential threat. But prophecies, as we'll learn, have a cruel way of fulfilling themselves, often in ways the gods never intended. What would you have done, knowing your brother carried the mark of destiny? Would you have hidden him away, or stood by his side, no matter the cost? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the choices we make for love become the seeds of our greatest tragedies. The day the gods came to Sparta, the very air trembled with divine wrath. Ares, god of war, and Athena, goddess of wisdom, descended from Olympus with a single, terrible purpose: to eliminate the marked warrior before prophecy could take root. But gods, for all their power, can be remarkably short-sighted. When Ares' massive hand closed around young Deimos, Kratos didn't hesitate. This boy, no more than 8 years old, launched himself at the god of war, a wooden training sword against divine bronze, mortal flesh against immortal power. It should have been laughable. Instead, something flickered in Ares' eyes. Not amusement, recognition. Here was a child who would fight gods themselves for those he loved. Here was raw potential that even divine sight could appreciate. You fight for him, Ares rumbled, his voice like distant thunder. Good. Rage will make you strong. And with those prophetic words, the god of war planted the first seed of Kratos' eventual downfall. Not through cruelty, but through twisted admiration. The last thing Kratos saw of his beloved brother was Deimos' hand, reaching through divine light, fingers stretched toward salvation that would never come. In that moment, something died in Kratos' heart, and something else, something far more dangerous, was born. The oracle's prophecy spoke of a marked warrior who would destroy Olympus. The gods thought they were preventing that prophecy by taking Deimos. They were wrong. They had just created their own destroyer. Loss can break a man, or it can forge him into something harder than steel. For Kratos, the absence of Deimos became a furnace that burned away everything soft, everything gentle, everything that might make him hesitate in battle. The other Spartan children learned discipline. Kratos learned fury. His instructors spoke in hushed tones of the boy who fought like he had nothing left to lose, because in truth, he had already lost everything that mattered. The brother who should have stood beside him in the phalanx was gone, taken by the very gods Sparta claimed to serve. How do you serve those who have taken everything from you? You don't. You endure. You grow strong. And you wait. By his 20th year, Kratos had become something unprecedented in Spartan history. A warrior whose skill was matched only by his barely contained rage. His commanders praised his effectiveness, but whispered concerns about his methods. Where other soldiers sought clean kills, Kratos seemed to revel in the destruction of his enemies. He was becoming the very thing Ares had recognized in that 8-year-old boy who dared to fight a god. But skill alone doesn't make legends. For that, Kratos would need something more. Something that would catch the attention of the gods once again. He would need to face impossible odds. And those odds were coming. War was Kratos' native language, and he spoke it with the fluency of a master poet. By 25, he had led the Spartan army to victories that defied logic, crushing enemies that outnumbered his forces 3-1. But victory, like addiction, always demands a higher price. The other generals spoke of tactics, of supply lines, of reasonable objectives. Kratos spoke only of total victory, not just defeating the enemy, but obliterating them so completely that their very names would be forgotten. Some called it brilliant, others called it madness. Perhaps they were both right. But beneath the tactical genius and legendary fury, the wound remained open. Every victory was hollow, because the one person who should have shared it was gone. Every enemy he killed was just another futile attempt to fill the void where Deimos should have been, and the gods were watching. Ares, in particular, was watching. The god of war had been waiting, patient as only immortals can be, for his chosen champion to reach his full potential. The boy who had dared to fight him for his brother's sake had grown into exactly what Ares needed, a general capable of winning any war, no matter the cost. But gods, as mortals often learn too late, always have their own agenda. And then came the day when even Kratos' legendary fury wasn't enough. The barbarian king had assembled the largest army in recorded history, a tide of savage warriors that darkened the earth like a living shadow. Sparta's greatest general faced his first true defeat. Unless he was willing to make a bargain that would damn his soul. My son. The voice of Ares boomed across the battlefield, and every warrior, friend and foe alike, fell prostrate before divine power. You have pleased me. But gods do not intervene out of kindness. They intervene when they see opportunity. I offer you power, Ares continued, his words echoing with the weight of prophecy. Power to crush your enemies. Power to make them beg for the mercy of death. Power to win every battle until the end of time itself. What do you ask in return? Kratos rasped, already knowing the answer would cost him everything. Your service, your soul, your complete and eternal devotion to war itself. The blades of chaos were not just weapons. They were extensions of Ares' own power, forged in the deepest pits of Tartarus and tempered in the blood of Titans. When they fused with Kratos' flesh, binding to his very bones, he screamed not in pain, but in transformation. The man who had fought to save his brother was being reborn as something else entirely, a perfect servant of war. Do you feel that? That moment when unlimited power comes at the cost of your very humanity. That's the trap that gods set for mortals. They give us exactly what we think we want, knowing it will destroy everything we actually need. What would you have done? Faced with the annihilation of everything you've sworn to protect, would you have made the same choice? Drop your thoughts below. Sometimes the right decision leads to the worst consequences. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre, elevated to the level of art. The blades of chaos cut through armor like parchment, through bone like air. Every swing sent arcs of divine fire through enemy ranks. Every kill fed power back into the weapons, making them hunger for more blood. And with each death, Kratos felt a terrible euphoria. This was what he had been missing. This was what true power felt like. This was what damnation tasted like. For 10 years, Kratos served as Ares' champion, cutting a path of destruction across the known world. His name became a whisper of terror in enemy camps, a prayer of hope among Spartan allies. Each victory felt less meaningful than the last. The power that had once filled the void left by Deimos now created an even deeper emptiness. He was winning every battle, but losing himself, one kill at a time. And then came the night that would define his legend forever. The night he learned that some victories are actually defeats. The village appeared out of the mist, like a vision from a fevered dream. Ares had commanded its destruction. Something about harboring enemies of Sparta. But gods rarely tell their servants the complete truth. What awaited Kratos in that cursed place would haunt him for the rest of his immortal existence. His wife, his daughter, Lysandra and Calliope, the two people in all the world who still saw him as human, who still loved the man beneath the monster. And they were here, in this place, at this moment, by design. This was Ares' master stroke, his perfect lesson in the cost of absolute power. To make his champion strong enough to destroy gods, he first had to destroy the man's capacity for mercy, for love, for anything that might make him hesitate when the time came to face Olympus itself. The Blades of Chaos were not just weapons. They were instruments of Ares' will, and Ares' will demanded the ultimate sacrifice. What do you do when you've destroyed everything you ever loved? When your own hands have written the final chapter of your heart's story? You become something that love cannot touch, something that pain cannot break. You become a ghost. The ashes of your wife and child will be bound to your skin forever. The oracle intoned, her voice echoing with the power of divine curse. A reminder of your greatest failure, warrior. You will carry their memory in your very flesh until the end of days. And so, Kratos became the Ghost of Sparta, not through death, but through a transformation far more terrible. The ashes of his family seared into his skin, turning his flesh white as bone, marking him forever as the man who had killed everything he loved. But ghosts, as any student of mythology knows, exist for one purpose only: revenge. There are moments in every man's life when the veil falls away, and he sees himself clearly for the first time. For Kratos, that moment came not in battle, not in victory, but in the terrible silence after he had lost everything. He had traded his humanity for power. He had sacrificed his family for strength. He had become everything Ares wanted him to be, and it was all a lie. The pattern was clear now, written in blood and ash across the years of his life. Ares had orchestrated everything, not just the pact, but the circumstances that led to it. The barbarian army that had overwhelmed his forces, the convenient timing of divine intervention, even the location of that cursed temple. It had all been a test, a brutal examination to see if Kratos could be transformed from protector into destroyer. He had passed with honors that damned his soul. But Ares had made one crucial miscalculation. He had assumed that breaking Kratos would make him stronger. Instead, it had made him something the god of war had never expected. Free from loyalty, free from duty, free from everything except one burning, all-consuming purpose: to make the gods pay for what they had taken. Think about it. What would you do if you discovered that your entire life had been manipulated by forces beyond your understanding? That every choice you thought was yours had actually been part of someone else's plan? Would you despair? Would you accept it? Or would you declare war on the very concept of fate itself? That's the choice Kratos faced on that mountaintop. Share your thoughts below. Is it possible to fight destiny? Or are we all just pawns in the gods' game? For 10 years after that dawn revelation, Kratos became something precedented in the history of the world. A mortal actively preparing to kill a god. Not through hubris or madness, but through methodical, relentless planning. He studied every myth, every legend, every whispered tale of divine vulnerability. He sought out weapons that could cut divine flesh, artifacts that could bind immortal power, knowledge that gods preferred to keep hidden. And slowly, impossibly, he began to find answers. The most important discovery came from an unexpected source: Athena herself, the goddess of wisdom, perhaps feeling guilt over her role in Deimos' disappearance, whispered to Kratos in dreams. She spoke of Pandora's box, an artifact of such power that it could make a mortal strong enough to kill any god, even Ares, especially Ares. But the box was not simply hidden. It was guarded by challenges that had killed every hero who had attempted to claim it. It rested atop the temple of Pandora, carried on the back of Kronos himself, the living mountain that housed the most dangerous artifact in creation. To reach it, Kratos would have to survive the desert of lost souls, climb the corpse of a titan, and face trials designed by the gods themselves to be impossible for any mortal. The journey to Pandora's box became the stuff of legend itself. Kratos faced sirens whose songs could drive men mad, navigated labyrinths that shifted according to divine will, and battled creatures that existed purely to test the worthiness of those who would dare steal from the gods. And finally, at the summit of impossible challenges, he found it. Pandora's box, small, unassuming, but radiating power that made reality itself bend in its presence. This was the weapon that could kill gods. This was hope. The confrontation between Kratos and Ares was not simply a battle. It was a theological revolution. For the first time in the history of the world, a mortal was fighting a god as an equal. "You were my greatest creation," Ares roared, his voice shaking the foundations of Mount Olympus itself. "I made you into the perfect warrior. You made me into nothing," Kratos replied, and his words carried the weight of divine truth. "You took everything that made me human and called it strength. You turned my love into weakness and my loyalty into a chain. When Ares fell, the very concept of war trembled. Gods were not supposed to die by mortal hands. The natural order of things had been shattered by a man who refused to accept that some powers were beyond challenge. But victory over gods, as Kratos would learn, brings its own terrible responsibilities. "You have done well, Kratos," Athena's voice echoed across the battlefield. "But your service to Olympus is not yet complete." And there it was, the trap within the trap. By killing Ares, Kratos had not freed himself from divine service. He had simply changed masters. The throne of the god of war could not remain empty. And who better to fill it than the mortal who had proven capable of deicide? "Take your place among us," Zeus commanded, his voice carrying the authority of sky and storm. "You have earned the right to be called God." But godhood offered by those who had destroyed his life felt less like reward than like another chain. Golden this time, but a chain nonetheless. And so Kratos became what he had always been destined to become. Not the protector he had tried to be. Not the weapon Ares had forged him into, but something entirely new. A god born not from divine will, but from mortal defiance. Power beyond imagining was his. He could reshape battlefields with a thought, grant victory to armies with a gesture, bring entire civilizations to their knees with his displeasure. The blades of chaos had been replaced with weapons of pure divine fire, and his word carried the weight of natural law. But none of it could fill the void where his humanity used to live. None of it could bring back what he had lost. The other gods spoke of his success, of how well he had adapted to divine responsibility. But Athena, wise beyond her siblings, recognized the signs. She had seen this pattern before, in mortals who had been given everything except what they actually needed. Kratos was still searching, still reaching for something that divine power couldn't provide. He was searching for Deimos. The discovery hit him like a physical blow. Deimos lived, not just lived, suffered. For decades, he had been imprisoned in the domain of death itself, punished not for any crime he had committed, but for the crime of being born marked by prophecy. And there it was, the final piece of the puzzle that would reshape the cosmos itself. Kratos had become a god to gain the power to challenge gods. But he had never stopped being the brother who would fight anyone or anything to protect those he loved, even if it meant going to war with Olympus itself. The reunion between the brothers was not the joyful embrace that mythology typically provides. Too much time had passed. Too much pain had been endured. Deimos looked at this divine being claiming to be his brother and saw only another god, another captor wearing a familiar face. "You left me," were the first words Deimos spoke to his brother in 30 years. "You became one of them." How do you explain to someone that every choice you made, every compromise you accepted, was ultimately about finding them again? How do you justify becoming the very thing that destroyed your family in the first place? And in that moment, something shifted in the cosmic order. The prophecy that had started it all, the marked warrior who would bring about the destruction of Olympus, finally made sense. It was never about Deimos alone. It was about what would happen when the two brothers were reunited, when the god who had learned to kill gods stood beside the mortal who had survived divine punishment. Together they were everything the oracle had foreseen. But even this reunion came with a price. The gods do not let their prisoners escape without consequence. And Thanatos, Death himself, was coming to collect what had been stolen from his domain. The battle against Thanatos was unlike anything the cosmos had witnessed before. This was not merely God against God. This was the fundamental force of ending facing two mortals who refused to accept that some stories must conclude. Death had come to reclaim Deimos. Death had come to punish Kratos for his defiance. Death had come to restore the natural order where mortals bow before divine will. Death had underestimated what brotherhood could accomplish. In the end, it was not Kratos' godhood that defeated death. It was not divine weapons or stolen power that won the day. It was the simple, mortal act of one brother shielding another from harm, even when that harm came from the inevitability of ending itself. Deimos fell protecting his brother, not because he was weak, but because he chose to be strong in the way that mattered most. The prophecy was complete. The marked warrior had indeed brought about the destruction of Olympus, but not in the way anyone had expected. This was the moment when Kratos stopped being the god of war and became something far more dangerous. He became the enemy of the very concept of divine rule, not because he craved power, but because he had finally learned the ultimate truth. The gods were not worthy of worship. They were not protectors of mortals. They were parasites, feeding on mortal devotion while offering nothing but suffering in return. And parasites, as any student of nature knows, must eventually be purged from the host. So tell me, fellow travelers through myth and legend, what did you think of Kratos' true origin? Did this change how you see the Ghost of Sparta? Was he hero, or villain, or something beyond such simple categories? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Share this video if it gave you a new perspective on one of gaming's greatest characters, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shaped our collective imagination. Because every legend starts with a choice, and every choice has consequences that echo through eternity.